right, we're going to cool it on the stores part, and we're going to move into actually working with users on our application. So we're going to be able to allow users to sign up, and everyone's going to have an account, and you can log in and register and log out and create a store that's associated with you and comment on other stores, and that comment will be associated for you and all of that good stuff. And you'll be able to only edit a store that exists to you. So in order to get up and going with that, we first need this login form. And then we're going to go forward and start creating all of the pieces to log in. So click on your login. It's going to 404 because we don't have a route for that. So let's open up our index.js file and go all the way to the bottom. And we'll say router.get /login. And when that happens, we are going to make a new controller called a user controller. And we're going to just say login form. Now, why are we making a new controller? Well, generally you have one controller for every kind of specific area of your website. And for this, we're going to have a user controller, which is going to take care of all of our sign up and registration validation and logging out and all the forms, password reset and whatnot. And then we're going to have authentication controller, which will deal with all the sort of the heavy lifting for logging people in, making sure they're logged in, making sure that they own the correct store, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't really matter where they go in the controller, but it's just a nice way to chunk things up and keep them with like code. So we're going to create a user controller. So we're going to go into our controllers, make a new file and call it user controller, capital C.js. And then we're going to import Mongoose because that's what we need. So we'll say const mongoose equals acquire mongoose. And we'll say exports dot, what did we look for? Login form. Login form, capital F, equals request response. This one doesn't need to be async because all we're going to be doing is res.render out the login form, and the title is going to be login form, or just login probably. Good. Now, finally, if we try to run this, we're going to get a bit of an error. You see that my ESLint is highlighting it, and it's telling me that user controller is not defined. Why? If we go to the top of our routes, we're importing store controller, but we have to duplicate that and change out store with user. So we have store controller is coming from that file, user controller is coming from this file. So now we give that a refresh and we log in. It should tell us that we don't have a login pug file yet. There we go. Failed to look up view login in views directory. So we don't have that view yet. We'll go into views, new file, login.pug, and we'll do our whole song and dance, extends, layout, block content, h2 equals title. Let's try that. Actually, we'll do dot inner and then a title inside of that. Now we have login showing up and we need to build the actual login form. Now, rather than just do the login form right in login.pug, I rather put it in a mixin so that I can include that login form anywhere I want, whether it's in a pop-up or another piece of the website. I can have it in a nice little partial. So we're going to go to mixins, create a new file called _login form.pug. We'll say mixin login form, and nothing goes inside of those parentheses because it doesn't take any arguments. We'll say form with the class of form. And the reason we have a class of form is so the CSS will kick in. The action is going to be /login, and the method is going to be equal to post. Then we'll have a h2 inside of that says login. We'll have a label for email. We'll have an input type of email, a name of email, and then we'll have an input type of password, name of password. We'll have an input.button, which is the type of submit, and then the value is going to be log in. Woo. All right, so we made a nice little mix in there. We can go back to our login.pug and import that mixin. Then we can use our mixin plus login form. Let's see what that does for us. Give it a refresh. And now we have a login form. Oh, one thing we forgot was actual email address and password. We forgot our labels here. Label for password. There we go. Login, email address, and password. We go to our login.pug where we're using it. Actually, we don't need this H2 either. That's just for the actual title bar. We've got our login page rendering. Good. Now comes the harder part. When somebody fills this in, wesboss@gmail.com, and I'm going to have my password as Wes because that's super strong. And when we click login, that data gets posted to the same route. So much like when we added a store, we posted the data to /add, we also need to now create a user and save it to a database. So, well, how do we create a user? We need a new model, right? Remember, models is where our data gets stored, and we've already just done store.js. Let's make a new one, call it user.js, and we'll start from scratch. Const mongoose equals require mongoose. And then we also need this schema. Another thing we have to do is say mongoose.P promise equals global.promise. And again, we shouldn't have to do that, but there's a bug currently in the mongoose package that will sort of give you false positives in your console. If you don't do that, it'll tell you that they've deprecated their own internal promise library. And because we've done it in start.js, this is the only time we should be telling it that we need to use ES6 promises. But if we don't do it in each of our models, it does like this like cranky complain, even though it doesn't make any difference. That just suppresses the error in our terminal if you ever see that. So we've got Mongoose, we've got our schema pulling in. A couple of other things we need real quick is just a few dependencies, and I will explain them as we start to use them. So we'll say const md5 is equal to require md5. We need a package called validator. We need something called the MongoDB error handler. And again, I'll explain all of this as we need it. And finally, something called passport local mongoose, which is going to help us easily create user accounts without doing a whole lot of boilerplate code. Passport-local-mongoose. Okay, again, don't worry too much about what these are. We will go into them in just a second. So first thing that we need to do is actually make our model. Again, our model is what our data is going to look like. So it's a const user schema is equal to new schema. And that is going to take an object. And then right away, we should just go ahead and export that. So module.exports equals mongoose.model. We're going to call this user with a capital U. And we're going to give it the user schema that we've defined. Again, we use module.exports there and not just exports dot something, because this is the main thing that will be exported from this file. And when you require this file, that's the thing that you're getting out of the file without specifying a sub property. So we have our schema, and there's 5 things that are going to go on our schema. But for now, we really just need email, and we also need the name of the actual person. So let's go through each of these. Email is going to be a type of string. It's going to be unique is true. And that's really important because you don't want people signing up for multiple accounts with the same email address. If someone tries to sign up with the email account that already exists, you should tell them, hey, you can't do that. That email address already exists. Then you want to say lowercase is equal to true. And this is something I wish I knew earlier. When I first made the thing that built my courses, I was having all kinds of trouble because every single place that I needed to use someone's email, I needed to make sure that I lowercased it. Because if somebody would sign in or sign up or buy a course or do anything with like an uppercase email or even just a capital somewhere in there, it would then not be the same email as the lowercase version that I had on file. So what you can do is you can say lowercase is equal to true, and that will always save them in your database as lowercase. And then we also use a middleware that whenever somebody submits an email address, it's always going to just automatically lowercase itself. So you don't have to worry about case in any of these. And it's nice to take that off your plate. Next one is trim. You want it to be true because people sign in with all kinds of, like I see all kinds of people signing in with like emails like this, gmail.com, and then they have all kinds of spaces on it. So if we put trim on it, that'll take off any spaces on either end. Next up, we want validate. And what we want to do is do custom validation on this email address to make sure that this is a proper validation. And the way that we do that is you pass it an array. The first thing is how to validate it. And the second thing is the error message if it fails validation. So we have this package here called validator, and this is a really good validation package for Node.js. And all we need to do is just take the validator and say is email. And that will just make sure that it is a valid email address based on having an at symbol and all that good stuff inside of it. And then the second thing is just a error message. So we say invalid email address. And if somebody tries to sign up with an invalid email address, this message is going to show to them. Now, we're also going to implement client-side checks with the input type equals email. So they almost will never see this error message because we'll catch it in the browser. But if for whatever reason somebody's on an older browser that doesn't have an input type of email, or somebody maliciously turns it off, we need to make sure that we are also checking on the server side and the people aren't signing up with invalid email addresses. Next, we want it to be required, which is generally true. Or if for us, we're going to say, please supply an email address. So if someone forgets to sign up and they bypass our client-side validation, it's going to tell them that. Next up, we have our name. Make sure you put a comma there. And our name is going to be type of string, and it's going to be required. It's please supply a name. And it's going to say trim true. That one's a lot simpler than the other one. This one has a lot of things to think about when you have an email address. So now we're able to create new users given that they have an email address and a name. Now, you might be asking like, well, don't they need like a password field? And that's exactly true. We need to be able to store a password in the database. So actually, we don't want to store the password itself. We want to store what's called a hash of that password. And to do that, we're going to be using a package called Passport.js. Passport.js is a middleware for Node.js, and it can be used with any Node.js framework that has built-in middleware. What it does is essentially it takes away a lot of the heavy lifting that comes along with managing sessions or creating tokens or logging people in, logging people out, being able to interface with many of the popular login providers like LinkedIn or Google or Twitter or Facebook. And it's just it's like the de facto library that you use if you need to do any sort of authentication inside of Passport.js. It's sort of like a base framework, and then they have these things called strategies, which allow you to do everything from doing things like Passport, Auth0, Twitter. You can log in. We're going to use username and password, which is called a local strategy. There's all kinds of different strategies that you can have and be implemented in here. And it's pretty neat, and it takes a lot of the heavy lifting off our plate. So in order to do that, we're not going to specify password or hash or anything fields in here. We're just going to be using this Passport local mongoose library that we imported, and it will take care of adding the additional fields to our schema, as well as adding the additional methods to create our new logins. So we'll go down here and we'll take our user schema, and we're going to just add the plugin that's called Passport local mongoose. And then we just need to pass it one option that says username field is going to be the email field. So essentially what we say is like, here's our schema, email name. Can you please add all the methods and all of the fields that are needed for us to add authentication to our schema? And by the way, I want to use email as our login field. You know, some services allow you to log in with a username, or they log in with an email address. In this case, we're going to be using the email address to log the people in. Next up, we also need to use a second plugin called MongoDB Error Handler. So it's a user schema plugin, and this is what we imported right here, MongoDB Error Handler. And essentially what that will do is this validation, it will give us good errors. But when you have a unique of true, it actually doesn't give us very nice errors. It sort of gives us an ugly error that comes along with MongoDB, and it has a code in it. It's just not something that you actually want to show to your user. So by having this plugin, what it will do is it will change those errors from the ugly error into a nice version of the handler. If you're interested in learning more about this, you just go to Mongoose Error Handler, give it a quick search, look it up on, there we go. So what the error will say is 11.11.0.0.0 duplicate key. That's not great for your user to see. And what this will allow us to do is it will give us much nicer error messages in there. So really happy with that. Look, other than that, looks like we are in pretty good shape. Let's move on to posting our data to our login. Now, this login form isn't much use to us. We actually need the register form as well so that we can use our login form once we're actually registered. So let's set up a route for that as well. We'll go back to our index.js. router.get/register. And that's going to be user controller dot register form. Then we'll go over to user controller. We'll have exports dot register form. And we're going to just quickly render out the register file. And that's going to have a title of register. Then we'll go back to our views, make a new file called register.pub, extend the layout. Now, inside of here, we could shell it off to a mixin if we do want a register form to pop up in multiple places. I'm going to keep it in line for just for the sake of not having too many files and confusing you, but totally doable in a mixin just as we've done the other one. So let's say a form with class of form. The action is going to be posted to register. And of course, the method is post. Then inside of that, we'll have h2 register. We'll have a label for our name and an input for our name equals name. We'll have an input. Oh, I always forget to put the words in the name. There we go. Then we'll have a label for the email. We'll have an input type of email. That's going to tell us that we need it. That's going to make sure that it is a valid email before we sign up. And the name is going to be email, and we can also make it required. Same with the name, we can make that required. Email, then we're going to make two fields for password. So say label for equals password, input type password, name equals password. Now we'll just duplicate that, and this is going to be confirm dash password. This is going to be password dash confirm. Confirm password as the text there. Good. And finally, I guess we need a submit button as well. Input type of submit, value equals register. Good. Give this a refresh now. Do we have that register? Oh, failed to look up register in the views directory. What did we do wrong? We put a register, 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 Regis Filminster. No, that's not what we want. So we want to go back to our user controller. We want to register that actual. There we go. Name, email, password, confirm password, and register. Actually, we'll pop a class of button on our register button just so it looks a little bit nicer. Beautiful. Okay, so we have all of our fields set up, and it's going to be actually a couple steps once we actually post to /register. Let's go back to our routes here, and we have our get register, but we need the route for when it's posted to register. And there's kind of a couple things that need to happen as soon as we hit that registration. First, we need to, maybe we'll write this here. 1, we need to validate the registration data. 2, we need to register the user. And 3, we need to log them in once they've actually done the registration. First, we actually need to validate the data that the person is registering with. And we try to do as much validation as possible on our model, but sometimes there's additional checks that need to happen before you even start to send the data over to the database. And in that case, you can also do validation right inside of your actual controller. And for that, we're going to go into our user controller, and we're going to make a middleware, which is going to do a bunch of checks to make sure that we've done everything correctly. So make a middleware called validate register, and that is going to take a request, a response, and the next. Why we pass next? Because it then needs, it's going to be middleware, and if everything passes register, we're just going to pass it along to the next person in line. So first thing that we want to do is sanitize their name, make sure that they're not trying to sign up with any sort of script tags in it. So we'll say request.sanitize body name. And now, hold on. Where did this come from? Is that like a express thing? Is that built in? How come I just like pulled that out of nowhere and now I'm just using this function called sanitize body? Well, if we open up our app.js, remember I said like this is a lot of stuff, but we'll come back to this every single time that we have. Remember we imported express validator, and then later on we used it. Where did we use it? Here we go. And what this does, app.use express validator, what this does is it applies a bunch of validation methods to every single request. And then whenever you have a request, you can just call the different validation methods that live on top of it without having to import the library or anything. They're sort of just always there for us. Additionally, it does a whole bunch of stuff. Let's just take a quick look at the Express Validator GitHub here. What it will do is whenever you have somebody send data to a URL, you can check the body, you can check the params, and you can check the query. So body is things posted via a form. Params are things that come in the URL, and query are things that come also in the URL, but after that question mark that you have. So you can check that they all are in the format that you're looking for, or you can convert them, or you can do some sanitization, whatever it is that you need to do. So before you actually work with your data, often you need to do some sanitizing, a little massaging, a little bit of working with your data. And that's exactly what this does for us. So we are sanitizing the body, the name. So request.body.name, it's sanitizing that property on there. Then we are going to check that somebody actually supplied a name, because we make sure that it's required here, but we're going to also make sure that it's required here. So say request.check body for a name property, and say you must supply a name. And then you got to check that it is not empty. Then we also want to check for the email. So request.check body. We want to check that the email property and that email is not valid. And then you want to say is email. You see how we're doing all of our checks. And you can also could say like dot not empty and is email. So you can chain these on and on. So you can do multiple checks in one go. In our case, we just need to check for email, because if it is not there, it will fail that test as well. Then we also want to normalize the email address. So we'll say request.sanitize body. I'm going to take the email. And there's a property called And there's a method called .normalize email. And what this will do is there's this thing when you have people sign up to your account. Sometimes they'll use wesboss@gmail.com. Sometimes they'll use wesboss@gmail.com. Sometimes if they're in the UK, they'll use wesboss@googlemail.com. Sometimes they'll use wes.boss@gmail.com, which is the same thing as Gmail. So Gmail lets you put dots anywhere in your Gmail one, and that's technically different ones. You can do wesboss plus test@gmail.com. So like there's all these variations on the email, as well as you can do capitals and whatnot. So there's with all these different variations, what happens is either people can be malicious and sign up for multiple accounts. I don't do that because I know that people use this for very good reasons. But also, people just forget what email address they possibly use. So a lot of times people are using these modifiers to sign up for my website, and then they email me being like, "Hey, Wes, I forgot which email address I used to sign up. Can you tell me?" So what you can do is you can allow people to sign up with any of these email addresses, and this sanitize or this normalize email function is just going to always normalize it down to simply wesboss@gmail.com. And you can turn all of these different features on and off, and different email providers, some Yahoo and some Microsoft ones, have similar quirks about them, but it just starts to cut down either on abuse or just general confusion and angry users. So we're going to go into our normalized email here. There's a couple of properties that we want to say. Remove dots, and that will be false, just because sometimes you do want to have multiple email addresses for the same service. So that is allowed to do that. We're going to say remove extension, because by dots and extension by default are on by true. So we say remove extension, false, and then remove Gmail, remove subaddress. And that is also going to be false. So if you want to know what all these possible ones are, all you have to do is go to Express Validator, look for this normalize email function here. Actually, if you do not find it, it's because you have to just go to Validator, because this is just Express Validator just sits on top of this Validator package that we were using earlier. And there we go. Normalize email, all lowercase, Gmail lowercase, Gmail remove dots, Gmail remove subaddress, Outlook. There's all kinds of stuff that will normalize your email. You make sure that you have those turned on and off depending on what your preferences are for your application. So we're sanitizing the body there. Next up, we want to check that the password cannot be blank. Request.check body. And we're going to check that the password, say password cannot be blank, not empty. Again, these probably won't ever trip, but if somebody does turn off the actual validation right here, because if I try to submit this, you see how it's triggering the HTML5 one, but somebody could easily come along and take the required attribute off of these fields and then submit it. So we do need to make sure that we're doing server-side check. We'll check the body again, that the password confirm is also not blank. Confirmed password cannot be blank, empty. Then we want to check that they are the same. So request.check body password confirm. Oops, your passwords do not match. And we're going to say equals. So we want to make sure that the password confirm is equal to request.body.password, right? So, whoo, that's a lot of checks that we have in place there. But it's like the simplest way to do validation in with Express Validate. You just build a nice little middleware that will take care of it. And then by the time we actually get to registering, we know that all the data is going to be super, super clean. Now, what we got to do is we got to get those validation errors. So say const errors equals request.validation errors. And that will do what calling this method. It will actually check all of these. It will actually check all of these methods here and put them into an errors object. And then we can just simply check. If there are errors, then, and in this case, we're not going to pass it on to any sort of error handling middleware. We actually want to handle the error ourselves here. This is a good example of actually handling the error yourself rather than passing it along to any sort of middleware. So if that is true, we'll say request.flash error. So we'll say errors.map. We'll take the error and we'll return the error.message, MSG. What this will do is that the errors here will contain an array of objects, including the error message, as well as which field actually had an error. So you could also use this to highlight which fields has an error, but in our case, we're not all that concerned. And then finally, if something went wrong, what should we do? Well, we should just go back and re-render this register form, but we don't want to totally clear the form. How much do you hate that when you go to a website and you have a validation error and then it just totally clears your entire form? That's not something that we want to do to our users. So we say response.render register, and the title is going to be register. And the body is going to be request.body, right? We're going to take the body and just send it right back to the user so that we can pre-populate these inputs once more. And then we also need to send the flashes along. And the reason why is because normally the flashes get passed along because it's on the next request. But because all of this validation and rendering the re-register is happening on one single request, we need to explicitly pass the flashes, which looks like this, request.flash. So if you ever need them on that request, you can just manually pass them like that. Otherwise, the next time they come around, they'll be passed to your locals, no problem. Oh, I forgot an arrow here, and we'll pop a semicolon here. And let's actually hook up this validate register method to our router. So go back to index.js, say when somebody posts a /register, the first thing we're going to do is user controller dot validate register. So let's actually make it break. And then we'll go back to our register.pug and make sure that you take off these requireds just temporarily so we can actually make it break and see what will happen. So let's go back here. We'll go to our register page. Name, I'm going to do nothing and push register. And I get an error. Request of validation errors is not a function. So one more time, we'll go back here. Too many R's, and this needs an S. There we go. You must apply a name. That email is not valid. Passwords cannot be blank, and confirmed password cannot be blank. Wow. So see, we did all the bad things, and now it's telling us what these possible errors are. And if I filled in some of them, like Wes and wesboss@gmail.com, but I did this as Wes and this as boss. Oh, what did we do there? We didn't do a type of password on that. Let's take a look. Oh, type of password. And the name of password confirm. I was being a hot shot with my selectors there earlier. So once we now submit this, it says, oops, your passwords do not match. Why? Because the password confirm was not equal to the actual password. So that is a first part of our middleware where we validate all of the registration data. And I should say the last thing is down here. We will, if there is errors, you return, which will stop the function from running. Otherwise, we're just going to call next and say there were no errors. And what Next will do is it will just call the next piece of middleware down the line. And that is actually, now let's register them. Let's save them to the database. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video.